Welcome to the Black Anarchist Podcast, a channel where critical thinkers come to learn and grow. Through pedagogical discussions, we challenge the status quo, conventional narratives, and present raw truth. I'm JC, author of Whose Life Is It? The Moral Debt for Life Enslavement. Today, we're going to discuss the ethnic cleansing of German civilians after World War II. Now, I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. I did do one live stream about this before, about Germany Must Perish. And I took it down just because I didn't want my channel to be deleted. And I would like to talk about it more, but unfortunately, when you defend the German people, people sort of conflate Germans with Nazis. So if you defend the German people, then it's almost as if you're defending Nazis. And these are not the same thing. I'm defending people who had nothing to do with the Nazi party, innocent victims, women and children, young boys. And so there's been a narrative that has not been presented. And today I'm going to discuss that. Okay, so after World War I, Germans were faced with a lot of persecution. In fact, many Germans changed their names in order to avoid discrimination. German language was banned in several states. German books were burned in public. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Orchestras that performed German composers were boycotted. German businesses were boycotted. And so basically, Germans as a collective were blamed for World War I. Now, again, I'm not going to go into detail about this just because I don't want to get my live stream taken down. But the short version is that Germany did not even want to enter World War I in the first place, but they did get blamed for it. Now, in Eastern Europe, Germans faced discrimination, legal persecution, and they were forcibly removed from their lands that they had lived for generations. These were farmers, teachers, tradespeople. Now, I've talked to you guys about the pamphlet, Germany Must Perish. This was published in 1941. It was published by Theodor Kaufmann. For those of you who caught that live stream before I took it down, this pamphlet called for the civilization of all Germans. It wanted the elimination of all German people. And what I discussed in that live stream was that Goebbels actually used this as part of his propaganda campaign. That basically there was a conspiracy against the German people. They were trying to get rid of them. Now, just think about how you would feel if you were German at the time, if you heard that there was a conspiracy to have every German sterilized, that Germans would no longer exist. Because if you were to say this about any other group, if you were to say this about Blacks, Jews, Asians, Palestinians, any group, you would recognize it as ethnic cleansing, and you would be right. Now let's talk about the bombing. We all know about the bombing of London, but we never hear about how the Allied forces bombed German cities. This tangentially, I also want to mention the fact that the Allied forces also bombed the railroad tracks, which prevented aid and food from getting to the concentration camps, which actually exacerbated the suffering of Jews because they could not get medicine and food. So I don't want to talk about the Holocaust because I don't want this live stream to be taken down. Let's just say the Allied forces were hurting. They were hurting Jews also at the same time they were hurting the Germans, right? I know that the Allied forces eventually liberated those in the concentration camps, but they actually prevented those camps from getting access to food and medicine. So in the beginning of World War II, 90% of the war deaths were military. By the end of World War II, 65% of all war deaths were civilian. In 1942, RAF Bomber Command formally shifted from targeting military installations to the deliberate bombing of German civilization populations. Their stated goal was to break civilian morale by destroying housing and creating mass displacement. The head of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, called the mass killing of civilians dehousing. Winston Churchill called for increased raids on German population centers, specifically to flood German authorities with refugees. They were trying to terrorize and displace German civilians. In April 1945, an AP correspondent published a dispatch that accidentally revealed some very damaging information. The information that was revealed is that these were terror bombings of German population centers, that they were not military targets. So, of course, they always lie and say, oh, the military targets were their primary targets, but then when you find out later, they actually were targeting civilians. So, just as we saw in what happened in Palestine, the same thing happened in Germany. The raids were carried out in two waves. First, they ignited fires and drove people into shelters. Then, hours later, when people come out of hiding, after they think the bombing has stopped, they're looking for survivors, they're trying to find food. Then comes a second bombing when everyone has emerged and they're completely vulnerable. So this happened in Germany in World War II. So they were trying to kill firefighters, doctors, and rescue workers. In Dresden, 1945, there was a first wave of bombing. The city burned. And then when the people came out of hiding hours later, there was a second round of bombing. Bodies were reduced to ash. Trees exploded from the heat of their own rising. The death toll was between 22,000 and 25,000, mostly women, children, and elderly. And then days later, there was another bombing that killed over 20,000. Across the bombing campaign, more than 600,000 German civilians were killed. In 1944, the Allies dropped an average of 3,000 tons of bombs per day on German cities. Churchill wrote privately that the destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. American official John Kenneth Galbraith called it incredibly cruel, and said that it had been of no military value. Now let's talk about the mass rape of German women. Now, women are always casualties of war, but the Soviets were uniquely brutal. Estimates of rape by Soviet soldiers reached up to 2 million. Many women were attacked repeatedly, between 60 and 70 times. Hospital records confirm at least 100,000 women were raped in Berlin alone. Female deaths directly related to sexual assault are estimated at about 240,000. Historians call it the largest mass rape in recorded history. Women of all ages were targeted, from girls as young as 8 to women in their 80s. Boys were also assaulted. However, obviously, there's not a lot of reporting on that due to social stigma. And Stalin's response was that basically the soldiers should have fun with women. I mean, I guess that's just one of the spoils of war. Eleanor Cole, who would later become the wife of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, was gang raped at the age of 12 by Soviet soldiers. She was thrown from a window, sustaining a lifelong back injury, suffering physical and psychological illness until she eventually deleted herself in 2001. Approximately 200,000 children were conceived through rape. Now, from the readings that I read a lot of journal articles about this. The Germans did not accept these bastard children as being parts of their communities. The German women who were raped were ostracized, and a lot of these children had very difficult childhoods. Many of these children were aborted. Some were abandoned at birth. And many of these women just didn't speak about it. They tried to just go on with their lives because no man would want to be with them if they spoke about how they were tainted by these violations. Columbia University historian Tina Grossman documented that the suppression of survivor stories was deliberate, engineered to protect the psychological confidence of returning German male veterans. But let's talk about the explosion. Between 1944 and 1950, approximately 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homes across Eastern Europe, specifically because they were German. The death toll is between 500,000 and 2 million. People die from exposure, malnutrition, disease, violence, and conditions in internment camps. By 1950, Eastern Europe had roughly 1/4 of its pre-war ethnic German population. In the Czech city of Brno, 20,000 ethnic Germans, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were forced to walk over 40 miles to the nearest border. An estimated 1,700 died in a march. In Usti nad Labem, civilians were thrown from a bridge to drown, with beatings and shootings continuing through the streets. In Yugoslavia, death rates in some location camps reached 50%. More than 48,000 died. Some expelled Germans held in the former concentration camps, and the Russians died, were now repurposed under new management. H.G. Eiler, a Jewish Holocaust survivor who had been imprisoned there under the Nazis, observed the post-war conditions and wrote, in the majority, they were children and juveniles locked up only because they were German. The sentence sounds frighteningly similar, only the word Jews had been changed to Germans. So the persecution of Germans is well documented. They were being persecuted before World War II. But for whatever reason, we're not allowed to talk about it because, again, as I said in the introduction, if you defend the German people, you're basically defending the Nazis. So Germans have been dehumanized, and there has been a blood libel that has been following them since the 1900s. I just want to make this clear because the German people are not the same as the Nazi Party. There were many Germans who were supportive of the Jewish population who did not support the Nazi Party. These were children. These were women, elderly women, many of them. And at the end of the day, they were civilians. So we can talk about what happened to the Nazis and what the Nazis actually deserved, because we can talk about international law, but I'm not even going to come up here and try to defend the Nazis. With that being said, Nazis were shot even after they surrendered. They were sexually violated. This violates international law. But again, I'm not going to defend the Nazis because they did commit some atrocious crimes. I'm only going to defend the German civilians. And defending the German civilians does not minimize what the Nazis did. And I don't think that Germans can be held liable for what their state did to other people. This is why I'm not a proponent of statism, because if you subscribe to statism, then you're basically guilty by association. Whatever crimes your state committed, that means that you did it, because, especially in a democratic society, which, by the way, the Nazis were not even democratic. So I'm not sure how you would blame German civilians. But anyway, I'm going to end this live stream. There's a lot more that I probably could talk about, but I'm basically scratching the surface when it comes to this issue. There's so many books and literature that you could probably find, but you're not going to hear this being discussed in the mainstream. So if you want more information, you're going to have to probably research this. But Thank you for listening to the Black Anarchist Podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The struggle is real and the fight for liberation is far from over. Get sovereign or die trying.